A Song for a Whale, Chapter 31, Part 2. Houses and buildings added to the landscape of mountains and snow as we closed in on Juneau. Grandma would be ready to get off the ship. That morning, she said she'd meet me back in our cabin so we could go into town together. The cabin was empty when I got back. I found Jojo in the hall and asked if she'd seen Grandma. She didn't know where she was either. Grandma wouldn't leave the ship without me, would she? I sat on the edge of the bed to wait. She'd been having so much fun on the cruise. This is what we'd all been wanting for her to do at Oak Manor, join in on the activities and make some friends. But that wasn't the point of this trip. We were there to meet Blue 55. Thinking of Oak Manor reminded me of why Grandma was living there. Maybe Mom was right about Grandma needing people to look out for her. I was having fun too, but I was ready to be on land again for a few hours, and I wouldn't take off somewhere and forget Grandma. Just before I gave up to go look for her, the cabin door opened, and in walked Grandma. "Ready to go?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm ready. Where were you?" "Origami class." She held up a red paper swan. Its long neck moved back and forth, and the wings flapped when she pulled gently on the swan's tail. "You did that in your class?" "Yes, with just one square of paper." Grandma showed me how she folded the square again and again to create a swan. And I made something for you. She pulled another folded paper out of her purse and placed it in my hands. A blue whale. "Like it?" she asked. "You made this for me." I moved a delicate fin up and down with my fingertip. With some help, I stayed after class and asked the teacher how to make a whale. I couldn't let on I'd been annoyed with her or that I was worried that she'd left me. Even though Grandma had been at her own class and meeting other people, she was thinking of me. And the whale, she didn't forget the reason we were there. I set the whale on the nightstand and thought about Grandpa's poems. Paper wasn't always flat. Sometimes it was folded into a shape that used the space around and above and below it to tell a story. A brochure from our cabin showed what there was to do and see in Juneau. One page pictured trails that were easy to walk. "Maybe a hike?" I suggested. "I have another plan," Grandma answered. "Another plan?" I hadn't noticed her looking at the Juneau information. She pulled 2 tickets from her purse and handed one to me. Printed in black letters across the ticket were the words, "Glacier Shuttle, All Day Pass." "We'll see the glaciers up close?" "And touch them," like Grandpa wanted to do. We made our way to the shuttle stop near the cruise ship terminal and boarded along with a few other people who gathered at the corner. The driver waited until the bus was almost full before pulling away from the curb. Near the end of the 20-minute ride, the shuttle left the paved road and drove through bumpy tree-lined trails. The driver pulled up to a narrower trail, and we got out to follow wooden signs the rest of the way to the glaciers. I wanted to run the path, but I walked slowly enough to keep pace with Grandma. Benny's blue scarf tucked under my coat collar shielded my neck from the cold air. I have to thank her again for letting me borrow it. We stopped to read a sign with a picture of a U-shaped valley covered with blue and white ice. The description beneath the picture said the glaciers carved mountains there. For millions of years, the heavy ice crawled over the mountains like a slow bulldozer, knocking aside dirt and rocks as it reshaped the mountainside. I looked ahead of us at the glaciers, trying to imagine them carving out the curves between mountain peaks. I'd always signed valley with my hands moving down to a V shape, but maybe that wasn't always right. So the glaciers would reshape my sign too. From now on, whenever I described to anyone what the valleys here looked like, I'd soften the sign into more of a U shape. After a few minutes, we were close enough to touch the glassy, ice-covered mountains. We'd sailed by some glaciers on the way, but the view from the ship didn't show the reflections of the blue in the ice. Other colors, too, ones I didn't even have names for. Maybe they didn't have names because they didn't exist anywhere but in glaciers. Ignoring the cold, I removed a glove to run my hand along the ice. We were there to touch a glacier, and touching it with a glove probably wouldn't count. The wall of ice was smooth, but not flat like I thought it would be. Like frozen waves instead of flat sheets, they looked to be from a distance. In some areas, the ice was so thick it seemed the mountains was made of ice. Then, just a few feet away, brown rock showed through a hazy ice window. This was the same stuff I got out of the freezer at home for my water glass, but it was so much more than that. This frozen water was powerful enough to carve mountains. It sculpted the landscape here as if it decided there would be a peak over there and there would be a valley. Over there, a ribbon of ice running down the mountain. Sure, I'd learned about glaciers in school, but it was kind of like the breaching humpbacks. Seeing them up close made them more real. A man who looked like a park ranger, dressed all in brown, talked to some of the people who'd been on our shuttle. I wondered how he could hear anything through the fear, furry flaps of the hat that covered his ears. In a spot where the ice gave way to bare rock, I ran my hands along some scars in the mountains. They were like claw marks from top to bottom. I took out my notebook and wrote a question for the park ranger. What made these marks? I pointed to the grooves. After reading that, he wrote back, scrapes from the glaciers. He motioned for me to follow him, then picked up a chunk of ice from the ground. He held the ice against the side of the mountain and dragged it down the length of a groove. I shook my head, not because I thought the ranger was lying to me, but because it was so hard to picture that. It seemed like the ice would just drip off the mountain as it melted, not rake a path on its way down. The ranger nodded like he understood my disbelief. The ice was so heavy, he wrote, that when it slides off, it leaves these deep scratches. I placed my hand on the bare rock, still freezing to the touch, even though it was no longer covered with ice. Like the memory of the glaciers was so strong, the sunlight, it couldn't get through it. Farther down the trail, a group had gathered on the small beach carved into the mountain next to a waterfall. Some people some people held their hands out toward the waterfall, then laughed and pulled away. Grandma walked ahead of me. Before I got close to the waterfall, the spray that flew into the air chilled my face with dots of icy water. I stayed back while Grandma continued walking. The water from the fall rushed into the pool of turquoise water below. I knew, without being able to hear anything, that this water was noisy. Grandma held out her hand to catch the spray of glacier water before the sea claimed it. She stood closer to the waterfall than anyone, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. When she saw me watching her, she signed, "It's freezing." So she had noticed it, but hadn't backed away. I took a step toward her, then stopped. I'd leave her with this moment. Face lifted before rushing waterfall, drops of glacial water sliding down the lines on her face. I wondered if she felt like Grandpa was there next to her, feeling the cold water too. Grandma laughed, a real laugh, one that shook her shoulders and deepened the lines around her eyes. When was the last time she'd done that? Since before Grandpa died, for sure. If it was possible that he could still be with us in some way, this is what I'd want for him to see. Even when the water is icy, the sea can melt away a drizzly November.